would happen in Richmond. They weren't prepared. You figure 53 men, they had no jail large enough to hold them, so they started tying down houses, nailing down all the windows and doors, and then chaining our boys to the middle of the floor. And that's where they would stay, and Parley would write of that great rebuke that stands in our history. During the course of the hearing, the case became pretty complicated. There's two good records of it. They were ordered to be published. One was published in 1841 by the Missouri State Legislature. It's a very interesting record in that in it not only is the Austin King hearing itself, but it has a whole group of about 100 pages of correspondence. It looks like Boggs wanted to put all the correspondence that he had received from his commanders in the field to help justify why they were in the situation they were in. And I think he felt it did. Luckily for us, we have that correspondence because it gives us some insight in exactly who was saying what to when and whom and some of the errors that they were making. So in the end, I believe as an attorney, it'd be evidence one of indicting them for malfeasance rather than protecting them. He also attached a bunch of things on the back end of it, of affidavits and other things never admitted into evidence and never should have been, so it was never considered, but in some way to help poison the minds of the legislature. In addition, the U.S. Senate ordered a copy to be made, and another copy was made in 1841 that just includes the testimony that was given. However, early on in December of 1838, so just after the hearings have concluded, the Missouri legislature was sitting. And this matter was, of course, brought to them immediately by us, immediately tried to be defended by Boggs, and they actually put a committee together to start reviewing what had happened. And the record that they had prepared, or that Austin King had caused prepared, they made a preliminary finding. Now, they ended up punting on this. They ended up deciding that they weren't going to make any findings until after the grand jury was going to be held the following April. Because how the procedures would work was this was just a preliminary hearing to determine there was enough evidence to hold them. And then you have to have a full grand jury hearing in which you determine if there's enough evidence to indict them. And the grand jury would not be held until the following April, because they only held them 3 times a year, and it was scattered depending on the county you were in. And so this group took a preliminary look, and in the end decided not to issue an official ruling from the legislature until after the April grand jury, because they felt they would be exposing all the evidence out to the public that might poison, as if how you could, poison their minds. But they did make an observation about the record that they were given. And they wrote, this is on December 18th, they wrote, "They consider the evidence adduced in the examination they are held in a great degree ex parte." What that means is that the record contains none of the cross-examination. When you have a witness that's on the stand, they got to have direct examination, and then you cross-examination to question their testimony, to put it to task. If you're ever going to now decide whether that evidence, that testimony was credible, you need to both examine the direct evidence of it as well as the cross-examination. But in this case, for whatever reason, which we might guess, Austin King decided that he would not record the cross-examination. So the only record now going to be reviewed is the direct testimony, which is curious. And so they say it's ex parte, meaning it's only one party. We don't know what the other people are saying. But then they go on, "and not the character which should be desired for the basis of a fair and candid investigation." This is the Missourians talking about their own trial. "Moreover, the papers, documents, etc. have not been certified in such a manner as to satisfy the committee of their authenticity." And that's because you had no shorthands in those days. And so after a hearing, which you'd have to create a record, you'd create the record, and then you have to give it to the witness that testified, and then they would have to sign under perjury of court that it's accurate, because that's how you make it credible. Then you say, yes, I was the one who testified, and the record that they've been prepared, I reviewed, and it is accurate in all material respects. And virtually none of the testimony in this record has been certified. So even the Missouri legislature doing a cursory look is saying it's very difficult for us to determine what's right and what's wrong on this whole thing. Well, even with all those flaws, one needs to take a look at what happened. And even with the problems that it has, a story is so clearly told. The first thing you realize is the very first page of this transcript, it's going to be now, I keep getting smaller text so I can talk faster. So pretty soon they'll be so small that they'll be like a graphic. But this, if you can still read, this lists all the people that are being charged. The case starts out with 53 defendants. And one of the premises of the law is that you have a right to know what you're being charged with. Because how are you going to defend yourself if you don't know? But we know that, that Joseph and his boys were never given what charges they were being charged with until at the trial. Most of the charges were not even decided until after the evidence was on. So how would you even defend? But very curiously, when Austin King prepares the order to the court, the transcript, the very fourth or fifth line notes exactly what everyone's being charged with, as if somehow that was all in proper form. To charge someone, you'd have to file a complaint. That complaint would have to go to be a warrant. That warrant then would bring someone to court in which they would then be told of it. None of those documents existed, and there's so many people who have testified who gives their accounts, from Sidney Rigdon to Joseph Smith to Hiram Smith and others, that they were never, they asked on repeat occasions, what are you charging us with here? There's 53 men locked in houses. And they said, matter of fact, we found correspondence as late as the 2 days into the trial where General Clark is still trying to get evidence put together to decide what they're going to do the next day of what the further evidence, because they only had really one key witness. They would call 36 people, but only one was their witness, and that was a guy named Samson Avar. And he was the Benedict of our trial. He was the dissonant Mormon who was the orchestrator of the Danite movement, who he would tell several people that he was testifying to save his own skin and turn state witness. And he actually pled with other members who were arrested, please go do the same thing or you're going to be kept in jail too. Matter of fact, Chandler Holbrook was arrested in one of those 53. And he was told that if you don't testify to the state, you'll stay in jail. And he's famous. He said, not only will I not testify, but I will stay here in jail until the worms carry my body out of the keyhole, and then they won't. Well, what we learn is that a significant amount, over a third of those that were testified, would either be dissonant or clearly intimidated Mormons into testifying. Why do we know that? Oops, let me go back. Why do we know that? Well, some of the people, like Morris Phelps, the fifth witness, he's a state witness, okay? Fifth guy on the stand. Okay, this is going on for weeks, these testimonies. He's the fifth guy. They pull him off the stand after a half a day because he refuses not to defend Joseph, that Joseph was not involved in the Danite movement. And so what would they end up doing? He would actually be charged with murder. And so not only would he be turned from a state witness, he'd be charged, made a defendant, and one of the people who would be actually jailed. Now, we put on a few witnesses, not very many. It looks like a pretty short list. The problem with that list, though, is that 53 defendants started at the start of the hearing. By the time the hearing was over, we had 64 defendants. Because what was happening is, as we started bringing our witnesses in, they started saying, well, if you know so much, I think you're a defendant. Now, so all of a sudden, Joseph called the boys off and said, don't call anybody else. Don't call anyone else. Well, that's the record that would happen. Then what would happen at the end of it, they would look at certain activities happening both in Davies County, the assault sermon of Sidney Rigdon in Far West, as well as the Battle of Crooked River would be the core events that would lead. And what would the consequence at the end be? The consequence would be that the majority of boys, 26 of them, would be let go, released, held in court for almost 3 weeks in the jail, chained to the middle of the floor, and then found no evidence to support any claims against them. There would be a bunch of others that would be charged with arson, burglary, robbery, and larceny for the burning of a couple buildings up in Davies County and intimidating a justice of the peace, a guy named Adam Black. They would all be bailable, meaning you could post bail and then come back in April for the grand jury, okay? Now, this is a very curious situation to be put in if you're a Mormon, because there's an extermination order that says if you stay or if you come back, you're subject to be killed. So I don't know quite how this all legitimately worked, but a handful of our boys actually came up with bail. And you look at the amount of money they posted. 2 were required to post $1,000. Karn was asked to post $750, and the rest of the boys were all required to post $500. That was the only amount they could. Those are the only ones that had money. The rest, the column on the other side, those 15 other boys or so, didn't have the money, so they were to go and held in jail. But Samuel Bogart had a better idea because he knew that they had stuff. So he became, remember, this is the captain that was the captain at the Battle of Crooked River, which is the core event that's leading to a lot of these problems. He takes these boys under guard and becomes their bondsman. And he goes up to Davis County and has them deed